Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to the Sun newspaper's set newspaper cover for examination from 2021 onwards, the GCSE Media Studies Eduqas exam. This is what the set cover for examination from 2021 onwards looks like, and this particular set cover will only ever appear in GCSE as a component 1 section A, either media language or representation question. If it's media language, it will just be about this particular set cover. If it's a representation question, it will be about this set cover in comparison to another unseen newspaper cover or article that they give you in the exam. Newspapers in general could come up in section B, where you may get asked more general questions about the Sun and industries and audiences, and I have separate videos for those on my channel as well. But in this video, I am just going to focus on media language and representation in this particular set cover. You're going to need to understand some context about what this article is all about and what they're actually talking about if you're going to be able to answer questions. So in the run up to the last few years before this newspaper cover was released, we had the Brexit vote, which I'm hoping you know what that was all about. But essentially, Britain was asked to vote in a referendum as to whether or not the country wanted to leave the EU or stay. The final decision was that the country voted just to leave the EU, but it was a very close vote, and so it meant that the country was quite divided overall. Half the country roughly wanted to leave and half the country wanted to stay, and it was the people who wanted to leave that just won, and that meant that the country was very divided. Politics were very divided, and there was a lot of issues in the following couple of years with MPs trying to negotiate a deal, which was basically a kind of a deal with the EU about how we would leave, when we would leave, and how it would affect our country, our people, our economy, and other things. It was obviously quite difficult to negotiate this deal because everyone had different opinions and people wanted different things out of it, and it was a very difficult thing to try and do, but it meant that this newspaper is kind of reflective of the time period where MPs were having to vote on what they thought of the deal that had been presented to them. So Theresa May had negotiated a deal along with the EU, and they'd come up with this kind of plan, like this is what we think should happen. But then it gets put to a vote with British MPs, and they got to vote about whether or not it should go ahead, or whether they were going to decline the deal and try and negotiate a new one. So the first thing you'll notice on this newspaper front cover is that there is a very large amount of images, very small amount of copy or writing. The fact that they're using large images and small amounts of writing, and any writing that is on there is very simplified as well. It does really reflect the fact that this is a tabloid newspaper, that the readers are predominantly working class and of a reasonably low level education. Now, I'm not saying that everyone reads The Sun is like this, obviously, but in terms of demographics, when they measure these things, the average reading age of somebody that reads The Sun is a reading age of 8. So we're looking at perhaps people who might not understand more complex political issues. So they've really tried to simplify it using big images, big simplified headlines, and small amounts of writing. In the image itself, you can kind of see it's a kind of collage or montage of different images, and all the images that they've used are kind of British iconography. So basically pictures that really signify Britain. So you've got British Spitfires, which are kind of an old type of plane. You've got the Houses of Parliament. You've got brands like Mini, like the Mini cars. You've got British tourist destinations like Stonehenge and the Shard. You've got red buses on there as well. So lots of British iconography on the newspaper cover, and that all helps, first of all, helps to target a British audience, but it also kind of constructs this idea of nationalism and a sense of Britishness and pride in all things British, and that reflects the target audience of The Sun as well. British, but also the target audience of The Sun also tend to have quite nationalistic political views, very much supportive of Britain or England, and potentially kind of to almost to a negative extent. So often nationalistic in a way that implies that they are very maybe xenophobic, i.e. they dislike foreigners, much more prefer Britain, if you like. You get the green countryside on the front cover as well. And that green countryside, like rolling hills and things like that, that is something that a lot of people associate with Britain. They see it as the kind of idealistic rural areas, like escape to the country. And that's quite appealing to a British audience as well, who see that as like the ideal Britain. And it creates quite a positive representation, all these amazing things that Britain has and that we should be proud of, essentially. So it creates a very positive representation of Britain on the front cover. Of course, having all these things on the front cover, combined with some of the language, it kind of suggests that if these MPs don't vote the way the Sun thinks they should vote, that we will lose these things. So we'll somehow lose our Britishness, and we'll somehow lose all the things that make us Britain. The countryside and the Shard and Stonehenge. I mean, obviously leaving the EU is not going to affect the fact that we have Stonehenge. It's not going to suddenly get rid of red buses. But the Sun is kind of connoting this idea that we will somehow lose our Britishness and lose our sense of identity if we don't agree, or if MPs don't agree to vote in favour of this particular deal. It's interesting that almost all of the images that are used on this cover are based in places that are down south within England. So a lot of them are from the southern areas of England, like London and below. There's very few images that are from like up north. And there's basically nothing from Scotland or Ireland on this front cover at all. And it's maybe interesting to think about why they have not been represented. So why has Scotland not been represented? Why has Ireland not been represented? Why has the north of England not really been represented? Because lack of representation is just as important as what has actually been represented. And I think there's several reasons. First, that the Sun has separate issues for different countries. So they have a specific issue for Scotland and a separate issue for Ireland. So, you know, perhaps their issues for Scotland and Ireland may have been more focused on them. And this particular issue is aimed at an English audiences. Also, potentially because of the way people voted in the EU referendum, almost predominantly Scotland and Ireland as a whole voted to stay in the EU, and so not the kind of people that would necessarily agree with this paper. So, you know, they are targeting their stories, they're constructing media language that is specifically designed to appeal to English audiences. Because they know that maybe perhaps Scottish and Irish audiences, many northern audiences wouldn't necessarily agree with this. Also, the Sun is not very popular up north. They've got a bit of a bad reputation up north, and you can watch my video about industries and audiences for the Sun to find out a bit more about this. But they do have quite a poor reputation up north because of a lot of history that they've had with reporting stories in northern areas. So perhaps perhaps people in northern communities are not the Sun's target audience, and so therefore they don't necessarily care about representing their opinions. There's a headline which says "For a Greater Britain," a strapline, and this is underneath the masthead, and it kind of suggests, if it's underneath the masthead, it's a strapline, that this is what the Sun is for a Greater Britain. So it kind of makes the Sun seem quite trustworthy. It makes the Sun seem very nationalistic. It makes us think that they are somehow going to improve the country and that they know best, you know, that they're somehow going to make change and make the country better, which would appeal to people with that sense of nationalism. The headline, Great Britain or Great Betrayal, is very simple. It simplifies a very complicated issue. But that simplification does appeal to audiences because a lot of audiences don't understand politics. So making it very simple will appeal to those audiences. It's very emotive, you know, this word betrayal. It kind of feels like you've got two choices. You either vote for Great Britain or you betray your country. So that it's the idea that MPs either have to say yes to the deal or they're betraying their country somehow. So it represents the issue as being a very binary issue. You know, you've got two choices and one of them is terrible. So it's making the choice seem very clear for MPs, so they're kind of trying to represent it as a very clear issue to their audiences. And this idea of making it like an either or situation with the word betrayal on one side, it makes it seem very risky and dangerous, and that adds a sense of drama as well, which hopefully will sell papers because that's what they're all about. Along that headline, you've got a slightly more detailed part nearby, which says that where the Sun literally writes, "We say to them." So they're talking directly to MPs. So the idea is the word "them" refers to MPs. And it's as though the Sun is talking to MPs. It makes the Sun sound intelligent, important, as though we are talking to them. We're telling MPs off, you know, telling them what to do. It makes the Sun seem kind of threatening, like we're telling you. It does sound quite threatening. And so, you know, perhaps that's the image the Sun wants to create for itself. But it does position the audience with the Sun. If they're using that word we, they're including the audience. You know, we say to them. It's this idea of making MPs seem separate to the Sun and the audience. And it makes the Sun sound as though they're on the audience's side, which must be quite appealing, I think, to the target audience, who will feel like they're being included. The masthead for the Sun is quite important to understand the media language there as well. Very bold, in kind of caps, uppercase letters. It's in block text, so like a block font or typography. So it's quite strong. It signifies that they are quite an important newspaper. The red and white is very conventional for tabloid newspapers, so it kind of shows that they're part of a tabloid community. But it also might signify like Englishness as well, like the red and white on the St George's flag. So it might connote this idea of nationalism and pride in England as well. The word the Sun as well, as a choice of masthead, as a choice of name for your newspaper, it connotes this idea of importance and power. The Sun is something that our whole world revolves around, and it's important and crucial for life on our planet. So using that as your title for your newspaper, it connotes this idea that the newspaper is central to our lives and that our world should revolve around it, and that it is going to provide us with the things we need in order to survive. So it creates a kind of representation of the newspaper being important and powerful, and almost like a kind of teacher or parent figure. At the top of the paper, they advertise their price. Now, the tabloid newspaper, obviously, price is important if you're an audience, don't have a huge amount of disposable income. And certainly saying cheaper than the Mirror will appeal to audiences. And the reason they're doing that, obviously, is because the Daily Mirror is their biggest competitor. It's another tabloid newspaper of a similar price. And so they are basically kind of dissing their competitor, and they're trying to engage their target audience by pointing out that they are cheaper. Within the article itself, you only see a very small amount of the article on that front cover, but it's important maybe to pick out some words which you might be able to analyse and talk about how they represent the issue or why they might appeal to the audience. There are phrases like a peace deal. Now that makes it sound like this is some sort of war. You know, if you're talking about a peace deal, the implication is that there is some kind of, war or violence or fighting going on. So it makes this issue sound very dramatic and engaging and exciting. They also talk about being on a knife edge, and obviously that's a phrase that we associate with something that is like very tense and dramatic. Again, a good way of engaging an audience. And there's a phrase in this article which I quite like and picked out, which it says, trust the people of Great Britain or trigger a shameful betrayal. And so this phrase, if you think about it in terms of analysing if you were in English, for example, it's about this idea of trust. You either vote with the MPs either decide to vote for this deal and show that they trust Britain. But if they don't, the implication is that they don't trust the citizens of Great Britain, which of course would annoy the audience. So they're using phrases perhaps to make the audience feel angry if MPs decide not to vote in favour of the deal. And this word shameful betrayal, it's, this idea that if MPs decline this deal, that they should be ashamed. So the Sun are making their position very, very clear. And the use of ellipsis in the middle of that sentence as well, it adds this sense of drama and it adds a kind of idea of something ominous. Something awful may happen in the future, that if they don't vote in favour of the deal. Don't forget the Sun is a conservative newspaper. They back the Conservatives for the most part, not necessarily in everything they do, but they certainly were a newspaper that supported the Leave campaign for the EU. They wanted to leave. They are run by a company that's headed by a conservative, very rich man called Rupert Murdoch, who is a billionaire, who also wanted Britain to leave the EU. So it kind of makes sense that they are representing the issue like this. It makes sense because of the way their target audience behaves and thinks. It makes sense because of their political standpoint. And so understanding why is important as well. So please check out my other videos on newspapers, whether that is The Sun or The Guardian. They're all on my channel, and I've also got a huge number of other videos for both GCSE and A-level that can help you with your exams.